Dean Rose, and this is a video I particularly, I've been looking forward to finding a way to express it because loneliness is an epidemic in our culture, and it's growing quite rapidly. There's now a minister for loneliness in the United Kingdom because there's so many million lonely and disenfranchised British people. And so it's an intelligent response, but one of the things that I want to contribute and explore in this video is how the mechanisms of loneliness. And I want to suggest that one of the most important ingredients in loneliness is invisibility. Because this is where you can be lonely in a crowded room if you don't feel seen and welcome as you are. Now, you cannot feel welcome unless you feel seen. And this is one of the big areas that secrets create loneliness and pain, is there is a very genuine question. If you knew this about me, would you still accept me? Would you still want me to be there? But there's also an element of if you don't know me, then how you're interacting is based on a projection. It's not based on me. And so what I'm looking at here is the stuff that creates loneliness. And my biggest loneliness in relationship to the high facilitators, the Human Awareness Institute facilitators. There's an event in my life which involved a therapist facilitating my first psychedelic journey, who was recommended to me by each of the Human Awareness Institute facilitators and who was a Human Awareness Institute facilitator. And the first loneliness came when I really wanted to go gently into this terrain. And he wanted to, I was going from this psilocybin mushroom and then later MDMA on top of the psilocybin mushroom. But I had tested 1/10 of one mushroom of this particular batch and had a noticeable change in consciousness and a noticeable opening emotionally. And it actually hurt me because I was with a girlfriend at the time that wasn't sensitive to my needs or boundaries or things like that. And it, I was talking with her on the phone, and it really opened me. And I ended up getting hurt because she didn't have the skill to handle the openness at a low dose, meaning at normal consciousness openness. She didn't have the skill of honoring vulnerability. And so at a high dose of vulnerability, she had the same skill level. And yet, I got hurt more. And so I was happy going from 1/20 of one mushroom to a mushroom. That's a 20-fold increase. But no, he wanted me to take a 60-fold increase for my first, facilitated, and other than the 1/20 of one mushroom, the first mushroom experience. So this would be, more of a really opening up to it. And the areas that weren't seen there is everything that he didn't know. He didn't know I'd been traumatized as a child. He didn't know I had early childhood attachment disorder, which is when you cannot bond safely with either parent. And so your first 7 years are spent without any secure attachment, intermittent interruptions for trauma in the form of physical violence, etc. And then there's no repair. So this creates extraordinary loneliness. So these are experiences where lack of knowledge, the unknown, for example, parents, an adult child with PTSD doesn't know anything outside their own reactive impulses to manage their own repressed traumas, etc. They don't know anything about the child. And when you're in trauma, you can't go outside yourself to empathize with any other person because you're in trauma. And your trauma is a coping state. It's not a loving state. And so, the issue is that not only is a child hurt, but it's unknown that they're hurt, which hurts them some more, which is also unknown. And this loop of going deep, deep, deep down into this vortex where the pattern just continues and endlessly, where as every new wave of pain and trauma, it's not known. And then the helplessness that comes in to experience that deep cycle down, that helplessness is not seen, so it is not known. So the fear of that helplessness, which is a natural thing when you need certain conditions to grow, to survive, to climb in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. These are needs, and they're not seen, and they're not known. And so the helplessness around that is also not seen and not known, as is then the reaction to the helplessness is not seen and is not known. Meaning, if you're not acknowledging that there's helplessness there, because you're not acknowledging that there are needs that are not being met that are creating helplessness, because you're not acknowledging your impact, and then you're not acknowledging any of the ripple effects from that either. It's like this one little particle up here sends out this spray in all directions and has endless ripple effects throughout the entire ecology of a person's life. Endless ripple effects. And none of those are honored, none of those are known, none of those are seen. And the trouble is, when this happens with core parents and teachers, and there's not a single present adult, there's not a single human being who knows what you're feeling, how you're responding, who you're becoming as a result of those feelings, and what you're feeling about that, and who you're becoming as a result of that. In other words, you can deteriorate very quickly from a feeling of hurt to a feeling of invisibility about being hurt, to a feeling of helplessness, to a feeling of completely invisible in the helplessness, to the feeling of desperation and completely invisible in the desperation. I'm desperate to get out of this helpless state. To the sense that I'll do anything to get out of this helpless state, this desperation, completely invisible. And the terror and the loneliness of that desperation, completely invisible. Because this person has no impact in their mind. Because you don't even exist in their mind. Because they're busy managing their own trauma. You don't exist for the core people that are giving you the messages, because a child is identifying every one of these things as something about them. It's a coping strategy. Every psychologist understands this, but a child takes the despair and says, it's something wrong with me. What is it? The child takes the hurt and says, I'm not good enough to be loved. Why not? And then the mind, in this lonely and helpless state, has nothing to do but ruminate on what's wrong with me. That I'm in this deteriorating cycle into despair, and not a single person around me all these people that say they're so great, that say they're doing what's best for me, not a single person around me cares to ask, how do you feel? Why? I get it. You're worth doing something about. It makes it appear that one does not exist to oneself. It makes me feel like I'm not here. Because if I was here, there'd be someone that acknowledged that I was here. And since no one has acknowledged that I'm here, not a teacher, not a parent, I don't exist, which self-referentially means I don't deserve to exist. I don't have a right to exist. Now, the gifts of a child, the enthusiasm, the innocence, the joy, the curiosity, the energy, the possibility, the curiosity, these are the raw materials of an entire life. These are the raw materials of a soul, of an experience. And when these don't matter, when these are all turned away, and the message is you don't have a right to exist, the message is also that none of that matters. None of your gifts, none of who you are has any mattering at all. You don't matter. You don't exist. You're not valuable enough to be seen. You're not valuable enough to be honored. Even if we see you, we're not going to do anything about it. That can be another fantasy a child has, that they really see and know everything about me, but I just don't matter enough. I'm not important enough to make these changes. And with my therapist, it was not important enough for him to learn the protocols before doing the work, to value the possibility of me emerging in a certain form of transcendence, as the self has a second opportunity to come in. When you dissociate deeply in psychedelics, it's very much like leaving the body and going back to that core consciousness before birth, and then slowly coming in. And just as my parents did not take the time to learn, to heal, etc., and it's very understandable. I mean, I have enormous empathy for the fact that they had far less resources than I do in terms of the amount of knowledge on shame, the amount of knowledge on personal growth, etc. So I have a lot more than they did, by a significant margin, and I can still see, the challenge of this, the enormous challenge to prepare for the honor and the grace of welcoming a human being into the world, either in the second birth, as can happen with psychedelics, or in the first birth, which happens as an infant. So there's a lot of sorrow and a lot of grief about the lost moments, the lost opportunity, the lost feelings, the lost love, and the lost closeness, because I had no love as a child. I never was able in this protocol to feel love for another human being. Only fear, only trauma, only frenetic, manic energy to try and get out of that terror and pain. And yet I was told, without feeling loved, without feeling safe, I was told that what was happening was love, and it was for me. And this is a horrific experience, because there's two facets going on here. One is the complete absence of knowledge. There's an art, particularly with a traumatized child, of making it safe enough for that child to speak the truth of how they feel. It begins, of course, by asking the questions. It continues by slowing down and attuning to the rhythm in the body of the child. It continues by letting them know that they're safe, that there's all the time in the world for these feelings, and that you're going to be there patiently as they begin to come out consciously for perhaps the first time. And continues with a commitment not to blame and shame the child, but to champion them, to understand them. I understand why you're hurting your younger sister. Because when I look, I see that's the way your father treats you. So you're learning from abusive parents how to abuse. You're not learning how to love. Well, that's not your fault. That's the responsibility of this country to educate and test parents psychologically prior to giving them the responsibility of a child. And this can be done in a way that, if you're libertarian, etc. There's a little bit of a meta conversation, I would just say, which is that freedom in and of itself has no value. It's freedom to do something that brings love into the world that has value. I'm a free person. I sit and veg out in front of TV. I eat potato chips, and I get fat. I'm scared. I don't do any of my dreams, and I punish the people around me, and I'm a free person. I do whatever I want. It's not a matter of are we a free people. It's a matter of, are we, to the degree that that freedom has any value, is to the degree that that freedom actually enables us to do something, to experience something. And so when nothing is asked, and when there's no knowledge of what it takes to ask a child to share the truth of their honest experience, not the contract with the parent that says, you got to make me look good, and making me look good looks like this, this, and this, so do that. Okay, well, what do you want to say, son? And then, okay, read your script, make me look good. Okay, good. Now I'm done with you. I've done using you, and I'm going to go and talk with these other people. That's a very different protocol than what it actually takes, which is the willingness to sacrifice the culture, to sacrifice the teachers, to sacrifice the parents, to honor the emotion of the child, to be humble and candid with that child, that this is not a perfect world, and you're feeling the pain of its imperfections. I am not a perfect parent, and you're feeling the many pains of my inadequacies. No, I'm fitted into this culture. I'm not fitted into the ideal parenting cycle. I'm fitted into my job. I'm more loyal to my job routine than to the routine of your body, little one. You may need to be hugged and held every 2 hours to reassure you as you come into this world and this and that and the other, but yeah, I've got other things to do. And so I'm loyal to the idea sold to me by a culture that is going downhill emotionally and telling itself how great it is. It's going downhill emotionally. Loneliness, suicide, etc. But I don't care about the fact that this cult of a culture has taken 80% of its people and made them significantly less happy than they could be in a different culture. Yeah, we don't care about that. Your feelings are not important. And that gets me to the next part of invisibility, which is that inside the culture, there are certain things that are noticed, such as your math skills. How are you doing at math? Oh, my son is very good at math, etc. So this is in the cultural spotlight. Every culture has a narrow beam lens. And in that narrow beam lens, there are 5 things or so that the culture says, this is important, this is good. Now, your feelings are not on that list. Trauma is not on that list. Effective parenting in terms of the well-being of the child, not on that list. It's a narrow beam and thus a very unbalanced culture that happens to be focused on looking good, money, degrees, how many degrees you have from what university, job and power, and being appropriate. And it takes a very harsh look at emotions, at needs, at addictions, which are a pain management strategy, at getting caught and being deep, and not knowing, being feminine, essentially. So it takes a very harsh look. If you show up in here, it's a show up of shame. And if you show up in here, it's a show off of victory. So this is our particular culture. And the biggest pains, traumas, terrors, etc. of my life do not exist inside the culture. Meaning, there's not a single American talk show that I know, where it's about, good, where, hey, how you doing? Well, I'm feeling really nervous and shame and panic. Well, what's up with your life? Well, it's just residues from all this past terrors and stuff with my parents. And it's like, well, that's very interesting. Let's talk about that. It's like, we don't want you on our talk show. So you have the hostility in a culture and the shame in a culture, and then you have your top deities in the culture. And the issue is, one area of loneliness is when our deepest feelings, our deepest pains, our deepest griefs, our deepest helplessnesses, our deepest despairs are routinely and systematically betrayed as a matter of the culture. We don't want to listen to that. We're not going to ask you about that. We don't want to think about that. We don't want to bring it up ourselves. We're just going to pretend that this whole underbelly of all of us does not exist. And so all your feelings about that don't exist. But we're also going to do one more. We're going to say, not only doesn't it exist, but it's not important. Winners talk and look about this. That's important. This is what winning is. Just go out and buy some more clothes and do this and that and the other. So it doesn't exist, but even if it did, you're a loser for it existing for you. And you've pretty much destroyed an individual, because when you take 300 million people and all focus them on one individual who's saying, I have feelings, this is painful, I think we need to talk about this, I think we need to learn about it. You have 300 million people saying, no we don't, that's not happening. And you may think it's happening, but that's just in your head, and it's in your head because you're being negative and you're a loser. And we don't want anything to do with people like you. You still want to be like you? Well, then we don't want anything to do with you. Or good, you figured it out, now be like us. Go talk about some money, get some power, get a better job, look good, perm your hair, etc., etc. So one whole arena, this whole area, all of our needs, all of our helplessness, all of our vulnerability, etc., it is not only invisible because it is hostilely responded to, it's you're a bad person if you feel it, which means that at your worst moments, rather than saying, oh, I need to get to a hospital where there's love and care for these worst moments, there's like, I've got to hide from everyone because this is a culture that will punish me. It's very literal. I go out to a dance, the doorman says, hey, Dane, how you doing? Well, I'm having some of the worst months of my life. This is happening. Well, see you later. And this person normally has a lot of time, for me. And once, oh, that's great. And that's what he wants to see and hear. And so if I'm outside of his little door, what he wants to see and hear, he's not interested in me. He's interested in seeing and hearing these things, which is the same message, growing up. We're not interested in you. We're just interested in you getting your homework, saying these things that make us look good. We're interested in using you to make us feel comfortable and good about what's not at all good for you. And so it's outside the culture. And within this, but there's also blind spots, because let's say we've got this whole bit of experience. So this happened, and 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 this happened. Then we come inside the cultural view, and this happened, and this happened. Okay, we acknowledge this little bit here. But then outside the culture, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. But we don't talk about that in this culture. We don't talk about incest. We don't talk about rape. We don't talk about psychological torment. We don't talk about why people stayed in a battered wife, situation, or a battered husband situation. We don't talk about any of that. So you get to have, this stuff exists. This stuff doesn't, because nobody even knows it. And this stuff does it because it can't be talked about. Now, in our culture, we have one of our biggest defenses is what's called keeping busy. And that is the question that is most commonly asked to me as a professional. Are you keeping busy? And this is, and if you say yes, this is touted as a status increase. With the status increase of keeping busy and the fact that the cult shames emotions, everyone feels a status increase in America when they are too busy to deal with someone else's negative emotions. Oh, they need to deal with that themselves. And then I'm busy focusing on X, Y, Z. And the message is, again, I'm superior to you because I haven't asked all of these questions. And these things shouldn't be talked about, and they don't even exist anyway. And I just dealt with this area right here. Well, there's a lot of pain in what I'm saying here, because 2/3 of me doesn't exist in this culture. And that is painful. But that pain does not exist in this culture, because the culture is self-referential. The culture simply says, no. This is our culture, and the fact that you exist outside of this little narrow box that we've given you is your choice to kind of excommunicate the culture or be different. Your choice to be different, to be bigger than the culture. And so rather than the hurt being honored, that 2/3 of me is not welcome in this culture, it moves to the opposite of, rather than apologizing and saying, yes, I'm really, really sorry that I've structured my life like everyone else in such a way that there's not room for you. You like to have deep, long conversations. Well, that doesn't fit into a busy life. And I'm rather have a busy life and fit into this cultural mean than I would like to have space for you. And me too, me too, me too, me too. So thousands of people all saying the same thing. Yeah. We'd all rather be busy than be with you, than listen to this part that has never had a chance to speak, or speak this part in me. Because the loneliness goes both ways. Meaning every single person who's choosing not to ask these questions, who's choosing to actively avoid this arena of the taboo culture, and is allowing just enough time to cram a few elements of the socially acceptable terrain in, is also hiding 2/3 of themselves from me. Including the fact that they may be terrified that if they're not busy, something of this will come up. And they'll be all alone in that, in a culture that is committed to not talking about it. So I see 1/3 of them, the 1/3 that they will allow to be seen. And then the combination of the forced busyness takes a great effort to be that busy. The forced busyness, which precludes anything but sound bites, and the fact that they won't tell me about their rape or incest and all that because that's culturally taboo. And they won't allow the time for me to ask them all the questions that I do want to know, but which they've decided I don't want to know because I don't exist outside of the culture. That's not how guys are. Well, I just told you it's how I am. No, that couldn't be. You couldn't possibly exist outside of our culture. No. You have to exist in here. And we can't talk about it. I've got things to do, but no, I don't buy that. I don't buy that. And so first of all, there's 2/3, that doesn't exist. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So we've got 18 units of loneliness here. But if there is any loneliness tolerated at all to exist, it's reduced to exist. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 18 units of loneliness, but only 5 exist and they're not important, and you should just get over it and keep busy. Well, just go out and keep busy. You don't have any more work, we'll go out and party and get distracted. Just don't look there. But when you're sensitive, when you're highly sensitive, as in the context of Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person, it's not just 18 units. Because a highly sensitive person biologically experiences things 1, 2, 3 times more in certain areas than someone who is not on that graph. So now it's not 18. Now we're looking at close to 50 units of loneliness. And then this creates extraordinary intensity of emotion. But none of that intensity exists because it doesn't exist in a culture that doesn't teach people to measure their sensitivity. So the person that's at volume setting 1 is pretending that the person who's at volume setting 3, the music has to go up. It's comfortable for the person at volume setting 3 when it's at volume setting 1. But nah, we need some more sound here, so we turn up the sound till it's volume level 9 for the person who's very sensitive. But their feelings about being overwhelmed, the feeling about being coerced into a painful corner when they said, hey, this isn't for me, that feeling doesn't exist because the sensitivity doesn't exist. And even if it did, those sensitives just have to work through it. Those sensitives have to literally go deaf with loud sounds blaring in before, well, now you're making progress. Now you're deaf. Now you're like us. That's more like it. The insensitive person, which is 80-90% of the population, is projecting their stimulation thresholds onto everyone as either the stimulations that should be done regardless. So now there's 300% more, but that doesn't exist. And the person who's sensitive is dealing with that 300% more loneliness and pain. Now, when you're at 300% higher amplitude, the experience of trauma exists 3 times more commonly, because there's a bell curve of trauma where you have peak trauma, being burned alive, earthquakes and all that up here, and then you have looks, and then you have shaming comments, and you have abandonments, and you have more shame and humiliation and verbal abuse, and then being beaten. You have this bell curve of trauma. And what isn't traumatizing for 80-90% of the population is traumatizing for someone in this highly sensitive biological category. So they're experiencing 3 times more trauma. Well, then we kick into the fact that we're trauma illiterate, and the fact that trauma requires some very specific protocols, or it will lead to re-traumatization, and verbal talk therapy is re-traumatizing for those types of experiences. Well, that doesn't exist in a world that doesn't study trauma and emotions. So now one's in deep trauma, in deep loneliness, being re-traumatized by the people you're paying to help you. And because they don't know that you've been traumatized, and because they don't know trauma, and because they don't know trauma protocol, none of that hurt, none of that anger, none of that fear matters. It doesn't exist. So now you're alone in the reenactment of all this. And so all that's visible still is these 5 units, but we're going 60, 70 units of pain and trauma is invisible. And then you add in psychedelics, which amplify things 500%. So now you're not in 60 units deep. You're looking at hundreds of units deep in trauma, pain, and loneliness. But that doesn't exist, because all that exists is up here, and maybe, okay, you're supposed to be sensitive, maybe you should have had 5 units, or a good jump to 20 units, but you're in the 300 range. And that doesn't exist. And you communicate, hey, I need help, hey, this is important, hey, could we deal with this? And it's brushed aside, because, hey, this is no big deal, 5, 10, 20 units of pain, they'll get over it. You've got a highly sensitive person dealing with 300 units of pain in a trauma illiterate culture where they don't know what trauma is, and they don't understand how to get themselves out of that bind. And then there's other areas. So we're up to 300 units, but then there are other areas, because this is the kind of height times width area where if you add one more set of 5 within view, you're adding, another, 15 or so out of view. But then there's the other aspect of culture, which kind of can kick in psychedelics. There's depth. Like this was all 1 unit here, but now we're going back 1 inch. Now we've just doubled it to 600 units by adding one more dimension. Dimensions of energy are not accepted within this little narrow box of materialistic, rationalist, reductionist, Cartesian thinking, which is our culture. So the fact that you've now had a sense of spirit and have a sense of how far away you are from that spirit is now an exponential crisis. Something needs to be done urgently. But what needs to be done urgently is unknown. And it's in response to a dimension that does not exist within the culture, so it doesn't exist for anyone functioning within the culture or around. So now there's this very, very, very deep well of invisibility and loneliness. And as always, the culture with its shame, you're too emotional, stop talking about that, we don't want to hear this, we don't want to hear that. No, we're busy, we can't do this is too much. And we're going to treat you not as you are, but who we would like to imagine that you are, based on our stereotypic boxes within the culture. And then you add in one more thing, which is that certain small triggers in the present that are not good. I mean, it's not good when a therapist refuses to respond to email with a client they've led into a deep psychedelic dissociation. It's not good when this is a secret. See, because now you've added a new level of whole loneliness because you can't talk to anyone in your community about it, even in your therapeutic community, because you're carrying someone's secret, their mistake. So now all this 600 units of stuff is being carried alone. And the message is that as painful as that is, we want to keep it that way. So we're going to disconnect your email accounts so that you can never find your way back to being seen within this community. And there's a deep existential emptiness at that betrayal. Now you're dealing with the hurt and the pain of being betrayed when you need help the most. This spirals off into a new thing of loneliness and pain. But when you have a trigger, when you've had deep betrayals in childhood, the trigger has a 10-ton, megaton explosion within the psyche, within the body. It's devastating. It can put you flat on your back. It can leave you completely unprepared for being able to go into the next meeting and close the deal, whatever. The trigger can let off a 10-ton, megaton bomb, but the trigger itself is only 2 pounds. So you have a 2L trigger, a little button that sets off a 10-ton bomb. Now, going back to the unknown unknown, in a culture that doesn't take the slightest bit of interest in knowing what your triggers are. I just want the ability to move around randomly, bump into you, and sometimes set off a 10-ton, megaton bomb, and sometimes just run into you, depending on where I hit you. That's what I want, because I don't want to think. I don't want to think about you. I don't want to think about your feelings. I don't want to deal with any of these complexities. I don't want to think about my own trauma. So, yeah, I'm not going to ask you any questions. I'm not going to give you time to talk. I'm going to look at you strange if you try and communicate trauma triggers. Before you just ram into me, could you pay attention to the fact that when you press this button, I have to deal with this 10-ton explosion going off in my body? Well, you should just deal with that. I'm trying to. In an emotionally illiterate culture where I haven't been taught a single hour about a single emotion in my entire education, I'm trying to deal with this. I watch this happen again and again and again. I don't think you want to set off a 10-ton, megaton bomb inside me. Could you please not do this? Well, I'm busy, and then do it, and do it, and do it. Well, you can only tolerate so many explosions before you regress into the reptilian state, which is a sociopathic state of survival. When you're in a sociopathic state, you are, of course, not empathic and not sensitive to other people's needs. Well, when none of this is visible, those people get furious at you, not the person who set off the trigger, not the culture that refuses to teach us about triggers, not the culture that refuses to teach us how to parent, not the culture that refuses to teach us about the distinctions of sensitivity, not the culture that refuses to deal with its own shame and its own chauvinism. So the individual who's gone through this entire abuse cycle then gets attacked again for being in a sociopathic state, which is biologically determined, meaning nature invented the reptilian brain to keep people alive in a sociopathic environment. What I'm talking about is a sociopathic protocol. What I'm talking about is emotional hell for a large percentage of the population. Now, any population that can put most of itself into enormous emotional pain and be committed to doing nothing about it, denying that it even exists, is a sociopathic culture. That's what it is. A lack of empathy. That's not empathy. Empathy is, wow, we've got a fucked up culture. Let's change it. Let's stop focusing on this, this, and this. Let's have a Fortune 400 list of empathy. Let's have a Forbes 500 list of the most kind and trauma-sensitive people in America and what they do. Let's have deep biographies about people who heal trauma. Let's have deep biographies about, the minority of healthy parents. Let's have this. Let's create a culture that responds to the crisis. That's empathic. Sociopathic is, shut up, put up, this never even exists, let's just move on and keep busy. So a culture that is sociopathic towards a good percentage of its own population is going to hurt a good portion of its own population. And in a culture that refuses to do anything about that hurt, in the same loneliness protocol, those people who are hurt are going to have to cope. And one of the best ways to cope when you're being violated repeatedly by cultural protocols is to develop a thick skin, which is itself sociopathic. And this is the way trauma regresses people down to a reptilian state, in which they're terrified and pain overwhelmed. And it's so painful to go into the emotional brain in a dysfunctional culture that you stay out of the emotional brain, can't love and can't empathize. Once you can't love and can't empathize, you are then going to hurt other people who are presumably in an equally sociopathic state and can't love and empathize about that, but maybe do a revenge dance or something like that. But this whole thing is an area of loneliness, because once you start seeing and understanding these things, it's immensely sad, and it's immensely lonely, and it's immensely painful. But if someone says, hey, how you doing? And I say, I'm immensely sad, I'm immensely lonely, and I'm in a lot of pain, their conclusion, since none of this exists, is, hey, what happened? Meaning, did you just get run over? Did your wife just die today in a car accident? And I say, well, it's complicated, but I'm dealing with a lot of, we'll deal with that later. We don't have time for that. None of this exists inside this culture. It's on the outside. And what cultures do is they train people to focus their consciousness on the personas that the culture rewards, and to just be conscious of this, the left linear logic brain, sociopathic performance brain, math brain, and not focus on the rest of the psyche, which is outside of consciousness. When you grow up in a culture that refuses to talk, refuses to teach, refuses to acknowledge and refuses to empathize with a vast region of the psyche and instead attacks it, consciousness cannot grow and become consciousness and develop within that environment, because we need to bounce things off the culture. We need to bounce things off other people around, which is why we are so affected by the culture we're in. It's a very remarkable thing. Now, this means that maybe 2/3 of the persona that might naturally develop for a human being and be healthy gets the message it's not welcome, it's dangerous to come out, and because you can't come out, you're going to go crazy in there. With a lack of regulation, you go crazy. This is literally how people lose their minds. So parts of the psyche go insane. And that's where that fear of madness comes from. There are actually parts of us that are insane. They've had no ability to regulate. And then there are some parts of us that are completely, vulnerably loyal. They just do whatever they're asked. You need a child that beats themselves up? Okay, I'll do it, Mom. It makes you feel better. It allows you to understand my feelings, because that's what you're doing to yourself. So if I beat myself up too, then we can have a basis of empathy, because you can't know who I am if I'm in these parts of myself that you don't know that you are. And what's particularly lonely and poignant for me as I explore this whole wheel of psyche within myself is to understand that all of the most beautiful parts have not been fed, have not received what they need from the culture to grow, have been shamed and banished by the culture, and that exactly what this culture needs to dramatically achieve grace, balance, and well-being by a factor of 10 to 20, that exactly what is needed are the very parts that the culture refuses to even acknowledge exists, shames and traumatizes and betrays as unimportant to the cultural agenda. So this, as each new persona comes online through emotional connection, etc., doing things not sanctioned by the culture, whether it's psychedelics or ecstatic dancing or traveling or deep slow meditating or hot and cold plunges, or laying and doing absolutely nothing for days at a time, each of these activities creates a new awareness of some part of our potential. And as I get to know these parts which no one has ever asked about, so that part grows and grows. This part that the culture doesn't know what to do with and either shames or just avoids, and this part that is taboo. It's taboo to just, what did you do the weekend? I laid on the floor and made a point of doing absolutely nothing. Oh, that sounds a bit weird. Yeah, we don't like that. And it's as simple as that. That's different than this narrow band meme. So we don't want to know anymore. We don't need to know anymore, because we already know this is the best. This is all that matters. So by definition, in a self-referential system, anything outside there doesn't matter. But as I see the beauty and the potential, this part of me could have grown into this if I'd had a chance to build muscles here. This part of me could have grown into this. I like this part of me more than I like this part of me, but it's never welcome at the table. This part of me loves to talk about this, but I've never been asked about that in my entire life. And this part has a world to say about all of this. This is a tremendous series of increased frustrations and loneliness in which these personas from a cultural lens are not important, nobody knows about, nobody will ever ask about. And on that basis alone, because nobody knows about it, because no one will ask about it, because no one's talking about it, therefore it must not be important, i.e., I must not be important because the culture is more important than me. I must not be intelligent because the culture must be more important than me. The same kind of parental dynamic that goes with blindly following the parent and internalizing the wound goes on with the culture. There must be something wrong with me that I have these strong feelings, because there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with the whole civilization, with the whole culture. But culture is the primary culprit. If you look at any culture as a cult and just look at what the rules are, and then you look at the world you want to live in and the experiences you want to have, 90% of what's valuable and important and significant as a human spiritual being lies outside the cult, which means that you are absolutely guaranteed to be limited to less than 20% of the psyche to the extent that we worship the cult by serving it in all these different ways. So this is it's a paradigm of looking at impact that can help us understand why there may be 1,000 times more grief, 1,000 times more poignant sadness about the beauty that's possible but is not welcome. I want to just close by thanking this part of myself that has so much to say, that no one wants to listen to. And I want to thank this part of myself for knowing that what this part of me has to say is more important for my well-being and perhaps for others than anything these culturally sanctioned personas have to say.